For many people right now, the state of the world with the immense amount of suffering, destruction of the planet, and alarming speed of wealth accrual of the ruling class can lead to feelings of overwhelm, helplessness, and despair. These feelings can spur us into action, wanting to address these issues and change the world. In today's society, more often than not, this energy is quickly directed into what is being labeled the nonprofit industrial complex. Donating to nonprofit organizations has become something of a go-to response to the ever-increasing crises faced by the working class. But how effective is this approach? Can social change, liberation, and the reorganizing of society be achieved through these means? As capitalism and neoliberalism continue to whittle away social safety nets and civil rights, more and more people around the world are turning to nonprofits for assistance. These organizations position themselves theoretically as a correction or a solution to the horrors of capitalism. However, as we will see, they're anything but. The incremental services provided by these organizations take the place of mass political organizing that could address the root of these problems, capitalism. Tonight, we'll discuss the many reasons why this approach will not save us. Much of the analysis I'll be providing tonight is coming from a collective called Insight, who was also cited in both of the materials for tonight's meeting. Their book, The Revolution Will Not Be Funded, is a collection of essays that I found like a little bit eclectic politically, but still offered really great analysis of the nonprofit industrial complex overall. I also want to note that I will mostly be talking about organizations that present themselves as liberal and progressive. There's, of course, right-wing nonprofits and think tanks and foundations, but they don't pretend to be addressing the societal ills that are created by capitalism, like a lot of the organizations that we will be discussing do. I also know we have quite a few nonprofit workers in here, and I want to be clear, this isn't like everyone who works at a nonprofit is evil and all nonprofits are evil, but rather why working within this framework cannot save us from capitalism and is actually a dead end to overthrowing the system that we live under. There are still some evil nonprofits, don't get me wrong. Okay, so we will start with some basic definitions. A nonprofit organization is defined as a non-governmental or private legal entity organized and operated for collective, public, or social benefit, as opposed to an entity that operates as a business aiming to generate a profit for its owners. Because they're private, they're also called non-governmental organizations, or NGOs for short. As we'll see, nonprofit is a little bit of a misnomer because even though most nonprofits don't sell goods or services that are paid for directly from the people receiving them or consuming them, they still do receive payment through government grants, donations of private individuals, and other fundraising efforts. As we'll see, like any corporations, the CEOs and shareholders certainly also aren't hurting salary-wise. Nonprofits cover a wide variety of groups from food pantries to political organizations, churches, clinics, and hospitals. The Democratic and Republican parties are, for example, both classified as nonprofit organizations, which is like laughable. For the most part, nonprofit organizations get their funding through grants of money or endowments, which are provided sometimes by the government, but mostly through private foundations, which are also tax-exempt organizations that claim to serve humanitarian purposes. I will go into more detail about funding later, but for now it is important to note that these foundations are structured like corporations and are usually funded by wealthy families who use them as shelters from both income taxes as well as inheritance taxes. We've heard of these guys before, like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is the largest private foundation in the United States with over $38 billion in assets. Some others are the Ford Foundation, which we kind of mentioned before, and the Bloomberg Family Foundation, the Pew Charitable Trust, the MasterCard Foundation, etc. These foundations have massive wealth and resources and have very little oversight or transparency on where their money goes. Insight defines the nonprofit industrial complex, or NPIC, as a system of relationships between the state, the owning classes, foundations and nonprofits, social services, and social justice organizations. The system links political and financial technologies of the state and ruling class control with surveillance over public political ideology, including and especially emergent leftist and social movements. The use of the industrial complex purposefully calls to mind the military industrial complex or the prison industrial complex, which are other systems that bring together the public and private sector in order to profit off of human suffering. It's under the guise of public safety for the prison industrial complex or national defense in the case of the military industrial complex. In the case of the nonprofit industrial complex, the profit is being made off of controlling dissent, advancing capitalism, and packaging it often as promoting human welfare. If you've been politically active in any leftist movement, you've seen this industry in action, surveilling and exerting the will of the capitalist class and the state upon social movements. A very recent and public example of this was the nonprofitization of the Black Lives Matter movement into the Black Lives Matter Foundation, which not only stifles the revolutionary potential of that movement, but later was embroiled in a scandal around misuse of funds. This is one of the core reasons that the nonprofit industrial complex not only will not save us, but literally cannot save us. The state uses NGOs as a way to professionalize organizing and limit its impact to activities that are deemed acceptable by the wealthy donors on whom they rely for funding. And the wealthy aren't really interested in smashing the system that gave them this wealth in the first place. All right. So before getting further into the ways that the NPIC impacts social movements and hinders social change, let's first look at how we got here. Prior to the Civil War, most charitable work was done by individuals or small organizations like churches that helped people who they deemed worthy of charity, such as children or widows. These early forms of charities were not focused on changing the circumstances that led to suffering, but instead helping people on an individual level. This is a practice that carries on through the industry today. This changed dramatically in the early 1900s when the first multimillionaire robber barons such as Andrew Carnegie and John D. Rockefeller created a new type of institution, the Charity Foundation. These foundations would support charitable giving in order to shield their earnings from taxation. They're still around today and are usually endowed or funded by an individual, family, or a large corporation. They do not source their money from the public, and they have very little oversight from the government. By essentially creating philanthropic corporations, these ultra-wealthy men were able to create a new form of tax shelter under the guise of charitable giving to the quote-unquote less fortunate. Both of these men are often sort of looked up to in traditional media for their philanthropic, contributions, which, of course, is pretty laughable. Carnegie and Rockefeller specifically went into charity work because they wanted to preserve capitalism, and they based the structure of their corporations around that goal. They had accumulated a lot of wealth through the usual means of worker exploitation and business monopolies, and in doing so had witnessed labor strikes and violence towards their fellow capitalists by the workers that they were exploiting. They saw that they needed to do something to placate those workers by alleviating some, but not all, of the material conditions in order to keep things running smoothly for them. Carnegie wrote an essay called The Gospel of Wealth, and in it, he actually laid out a very clear understanding of class relations and the way that they've changed in regard to the means of production, which at that point, of course, he owned a lot of the means of production. He laments how unfortunate it is that the wealthy can just accrue so much wealth while the people who work from him suffer. But unfortunately, he can't think of a better way of organizing society. So he just accepts that capitalism is the only way forward and urges his fellow millionaires to help him preserve the system by bestowing charity upon those who they felt were deserving. Naturally, the ones deemed acceptable as recipients of these philanthropic donations were those who didn't directly challenge capitalism, didn't pose a threat to their bank accounts, and were still willing to be hard workers. Carnegie believed that the traditional charity method of just giving to people indiscriminately would encourage lazy, drunk, and unworthy people to persist in their ways. This is also another seed that we see going through the NPIC today with sort of like a bootstrap mentality. Almost right away, critics raised alarm bells about this type of philanthropy, warning that foundations could be weaponized in a way that was harmful to the people they were claiming to help. The U.S. Commission on Industrial Relations actually filed a report with Congress around this time, warning that charitable foundations were a grave menace because they concentrated money and power for their wealthy donors and allowed them to control the narrative around social issues. Local history. The Colorado miners' strike against Colorado Fuel and Iron in 1913, which led up to the Ludlow Massacre of 1914, is an early example of the ways that foundations were already intervening in social movements. 40% of Colorado Fuel and Iron was owned by Rockefeller, who had just started the Rockefeller Foundation. As miners in Colorado were organizing and engaging in open warfare against their bosses, The secretary of the Rockefeller Foundation made quieting social and political unrest a huge priority of the organization. After the Ludlow massacre, the Rockefeller Foundation made it clear that they wanted to help individual workers, but not organized ones, because of course, organized workers and unions were a quote unquote threat to society, which, duh. So even at inception, the very first nonprofit organizations that created the model we see today were founded on the principle that they should selectively only help some people who didn't pose any kind of threat to their bank accounts specifically, but also capitalism in general. After World War II, charitable foundations surged in popularity and scope. One of the largest foundations to be born at this time was the Ford Foundation, which today has the stated goal of promoting human welfare, which they seem to mostly be doing through advancing US imperialism around the globe, which is something that we will definitely talk about later. Originally, though, the Ford Foundation was founded in reaction to FDR's tax reforms in 1935 that introduced a 70% tax rate on large inheritance. The Ford family did not want to be paying 70% on their inheritances, and they created the Ford Foundation as a way to shelter their income and pass it along in perpetuity to their families without having to pay that. According to Wikipedia, the Ford Foundation was started with today's equivalent of $500,000, and they are currently worth $16 billion in assets. Just chilling there. By the early 1960s, foundations were growing at a rate of over 1,000 per year, and financial and tax advisors were promoting foundations to their clients as a way to shelter their taxes due to the lack of regulation on the federal level. In response, Congress passed another Tax Reform Act in 1969, which placed some regulations on private foundations, notably requirements to spend a small percentage of their returns in order to slow their wealth hoarding. In 1969, this was 6% annually that they were required to give away, and it has now been lowered to 5%. One of the results of this legislation was a rise in the type of groups that organize themselves as nonprofits, since private foundations could make tax-deductible donations to these type of groups in order to fulfill this payout rule. A 501c3 is a tax designation for these organizations, which are religious, charitable, scientific, or educational. In order to receive grants from private foundations, this tax status must be achieved by the organizations first. They can't just be, giving away money without a tax break. Throughout the late 60s and 70s, there was a huge uptick in radical movements, and the private foundations were not having it. There's a couple essays in the Insight book that go into more detail about this and outline the ways that foundations would intervene and shape movements to make sure they didn't actually challenge the status quo too much. One example used is the Ford Foundation's support of certain Black power groups, such as the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, where they kind of intervened and shift the focus off of Black liberation and instead into Black capitalism, the recruitment of key movement leaders, and funding of racial justice organizations that focused on policy reform instead of actual social change. This is a screenshot from the Ford Foundation's page on their civil rights grants. So they're really proud of this. And it describes this exact same thing, that they intentionally were moving leaders away from, quote, direct protest action and towards minority enterprise and economic development using investment capital. This is a similar trajectory to what we saw with the Black Lives Matter movement. My personal enemy, DeRay McKesson here, which was tainted on with Democratic Party funding, early on with Democratic Party funding, funneling of BLM activists into what I kind of call TED Talk activism, and eventually the founding of the Black Lives Matter Foundation, which no longer does any on-the-ground organizing or even challenging the cops, but rather, and I'm quoting from their website here, operates as an abolitionist-centered foundation, utilizing a hybrid model to drive impactful change by funding organizations and individuals leading policy and abolitionist efforts, concurrently fostering action in alignment with our core pillars. Additionally, we collaborate with organizations and individuals providing direct services that address the essential needs of Black communities. So it's quite a far cry from the anti-establishment and anti-police messaging put forth at the beginning of this movement. According to Insight, in 1953, there were 50,000 nonprofit organizations registered in the United States. And today, some estimates put that number at 10 million, just to get an idea of the scope. Okay, so the nonprofit industrial complex creates a loop where wealthy people and families create foundations that allow them to not pay taxes on a large portion of their money, which they make by exploiting their workers. This robs the public of tax money that should be going to public services and social safety nets, which we know are disappearing at an ever increasing pace due to decades of neoliberalism and just capitalism in general. Foundations can then turn around and offer quote unquote relief to the public whose hardships are the results of capitalism and corporate exploitation in the first place. It is more or less a diversion of funds from the public into the hands of the wealthy who can then distribute those funds as they see fit. Today, NGOs represent over $1 trillion in economic activity, which makes them representative of the wealth of some of the richest nations on earth. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that in 2017, almost 13 million people had jobs at a nonprofit. So the next big part of this is, of course, the money and funding. As we just learned, these private foundations are a great way for wealthy people to hide some of their income and inheritances. And in order for them to maintain these tax-exempt statuses, they have to give away 5% of their assets annually. This is known as the 5% payout rule. This is done in the form of grants to nonprofit organizations or NGOs. In order for your NGO to receive these funds, which are intended to cover your operating costs and any special projects that your nonprofit wants to do, you must apply for various grants offered by these foundations, all of which, of course, are run by extremely wealthy people and trusts who have a personal vested interest in the continuation of capitalism. In order to qualify for nonprofit status, organizations must structure themselves in a very corporate hierarchical sort of way and establish strict bylaws and then register with the IRS as a 501c3. This tax status allows the organization to access the grant money from foundations and the government without paying income tax on that money as well. So none of these things are required to do the work, of course, but they're really there to make nonprofits seem desirable to investors. Once an organization has won a grant, it makes the organization beholden and accountable to those who are funding them, rather than those who it may have set out to serve. Once an organization, and that money is not guaranteed. Grants come with strings attached and can be rescinded at any time. We're kind of seeing this now with USAID and a lot of the federal stuff that's being pulled, so maybe we can talk about that later. In the Insight book, they tell their personal experience with this in the intro. They talk about their experience applying for a grant from the Ford Foundation. They received approval for their proposal to cover their general operating expenses for 2 years. A few months later, after they committed to 2 large projects, which were centered around domestic violence, the Ford Foundation reached back out to them and reversed their decision, took back the money, all because they had found the organization's statement of support for the Palestinian liberation struggle. So this funding structure where money comes from diehard capitalists with strings attached means that ultimately the wealthy are controlling much of the struggle for social justice. The stipulations that come with grants often result in what is called mission drift. One of the requirements of an NGO set out by the IRS is that they have a stated mission that should establish the goals of the organization, as well as what it does, who it serves, and how and where they're conducting their work. However, in order to get grants, many organizations feel compelled to modify their work or mission statement in order to fulfill the requirements to get funding. Over time, this shifts the focus of the nonprofit away from their original goals and turns the focus to quantitative goals like fundraising or meeting corporate-style benchmarks instead of making a material impact in people's lives. Additionally, there are only so many grants available every year, and the competition around securing these limited funds creates all kinds of other issues, such as discouraging cross-organization collaboration that could address root causes of social issues. So obviously very anti-solidarity. And it also causes the professionalization of activist work. The NPIC has developed a professional class of executives, fundraisers, lawyers, grant writers, and compliance officials. These nonprofit professionals have their own network of conference circuits, academic programs, and professional associations. Doing this professionalization of activist work is ultimately unsustainable. The NPIC encourages us to think of social organizing and organizing against oppression as a career. You do the work and then you get paid. And also, once a job industry has grown up around something this way, the people engaged in it have a vested interest in keeping that industry alive. Meaning the focus, again, is on the organization and fundraising and grant writing, as opposed to addressing the causes that the organization was created for. This slide is just like a few screenshots of small businesses that have sprung out around helping people maneuver getting funds for your nonprofit organization, basically. So now that we know how we got here and how the money flows through the NPIC, we can address why this model of organizing cannot save us from capitalism by looking at the ways in which mass social movements can be stifled by this industry. So one of the materials tonight was a talk from the Socialism Conference in 2018, I believe. And in that speech, one of the speakers named Erica brings up Antonio Gramsci's theory of the state and civil society. He divides sort of our life and the state into civil society and political society. In civil society, that's where the ideas and norms are shaped through cultural institutions such as the education system, the family, and the media. As we'll see, nonprofits and the industry around them also falls into this category. Through these institutions, societal consent is manufactured and cultural hegemony is shaped. The other part of the state is political society, which is made up of institutions that enforce the will of the state when consent is not obtained. Some of these institutions include the courts, who can tell you that you need to do something, and the police, who will take you away and punish you if you don't do that thing. Essentially, legal sanctions and state repression are functions of the political society. These are the ways that the capitalist class can use the state to enforce their will upon the people, whether they consent or not. The NPIC engages in the civil society aspect of this theory as institutions that enforce the hegemonic or dominant ideology by upholding the status quo. Nonprofits, in the services they give, the curriculums they may write, the media campaigns they deploy, it all reinforces and perpetuates certain ideas and frames socially appropriate solutions to various problems. And of course, the appropriate solution is never the working class organizing and fighting capitalism. They also put forth the most appropriate way to go about bringing change, which is usually working for a nonprofit, donating, voting at the booth or with your dollar, etc. Ultimately, this only benefits capitalism because well-intentioned people who want to make social change are being funneled into this type of work, which is designed to not rock the boat or challenge the root cause of this issue at all. If they were to do so, they could lose the funding that pays for their salaries, which they receive for being professionalized activists. Also in this talk, there was a few examples used to illustrate how the NPIC enforces the status quo, first through manipulating society's consent, and then by force if necessary. The example used first was homelessness, which is a huge issue in this country, and there are countless nonprofits that are designed to address this problem. Through their messaging, it's clear that the most acceptable solution is often homeless shelters or temporary housing, hot meals, showers, etc. It's never helping the homeless community organize themselves and find a solution that they feel is appropriate, or just housing them. You can see here, this is a list that I pulled off the internet of some, but probably not all of the NGOs in Denver specifically that serve the homeless population. Many of them provide vital stopgap services, but none of them provide permanent housing or support growing the power of this population to advocate for themselves. I also made a little snarky comment down here about Drip Cafe, the homophobic coffee shop that we've been trying to run out of business for almost 2 years. One of their alleged services that they provide is jobs for people who are unhoused, which of course we know means that they would exploit them for their labor. But they've never actually followed through on this alleged mission, and they were not on any homeless NGO list that I pulled out, so had to whack them. Anyway, because this becomes the dominant ideology that homelessness should be dealt with through shelters or other forms of charity, it also flows easily into the idea that homeless people who do not comply with being pushed into shelters or quote unquote swept around the cities should be punished or should be forced into shelters by the state, i.e., the cops, for, of course, their own good. So through media, training, and curriculums, etc., nonprofits can perpetuate the correct way to deal with problems created under capitalism. And because they don't have an actual interest in challenging the system, they perpetuate the dominant ideology, and when need be, this can justify the use of violence by the state against those who do not comply. Another way that this works is through political nonprofits who spring up around certain issues such as abortion, queer rights, but funnel their work into lobbying or voting instead of even occupying Congress, organizing a strike, or organizing a mass movement at all. The NPIC also has a huge influence globally, and it's not great news there either. Internationally, both foundations and NGOs have a long and documented history of advancing and supporting first world interests around the globe and asserting them in particular into volatile political situations under the guise of maintaining peace. They're not official government bodies, but often work closely with the State Department, particularly the CIA, to gather information from places where official government entities can't go. Private foundations, through the vehicle of NGOs, are the biggest funders of the social sciences and the arts, endowing courses and student scholarships in developmental studies, community studies, and human rights. On paper, that sounds great. I love human rights. However, these foundations issue grants and scholarships that fund artists, activists, and even university courses, but come with restrictions about the content and activity that can be done with those funds. In this way, wealthy donors and foundations are easily able to control narratives and lay out the expectations of what is and isn't acceptable when it comes to addressing capitalism globally. Tons of private foundations invest in developing countries, and one of the biggest one is the Ford Foundation, who we've brought up a few times. They have the stated goal, like I said, of promoting human welfare and have worked extremely closely with the US State Department since its inception in 1936. After World War II, when communism became the new enemy, number one, the Ford Foundation, as well as the Rockefeller Foundation, began funding various nonprofits that basically worked as extensions of the US government in countries where the State Department was, doing their toppling government thing. One example of this was the establishment of a US-style economics course at the Indonesian University that was sponsored by the Ford Foundation. Students were trained in counterinsurgency in an economics course and US hegemony, and those very students played a crucial part in helping the CIA overthrow the government in 1965, which resulted in the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of Indonesian communists at the hands of the US-backed General Suharto. In another book that I read for this, Capitalism, A Ghost Story, Arundhati Roy talks about the impact of global capitalism in India, and she also addresses the important role that some NGOs can fill by gathering information on activists and resistance movement and stifling them from within. This is a quote from her. The corporate or foundation endowed NGOs are global finance's way of buying into resistance movement, literally as shareholders buy share in companies and then try to control them from within. They sit like nodes on the central nervous system, the pathways along which global finance flows. They work like transmitters, receivers, shock absorbers, alert to every impulse, careful to never annoy the governments of their host countries. Inadvertently and sometimes advertently, they serve as listening posts, their reports and workshops and other missionary activity feeding data into an increasingly aggressive system of surveillance of increasingly hardened states. The more troubled an area, the greater the number of NGOs in it. Up to this point, I've been focused on the flow of money and influence within the NPIC, how the ultra wealthy are the ones guiding society on acceptable forms of organizing, and how NGOs are used to serve their interests and protect global capitalism and Western interests and anti-communism worldwide. But what about the often well-meaning people who start or join a nonprofit as an earnest attempt to make the world better? Nonprofit workers often enter the industry because they sincerely want to make a difference and help others who are being especially targeted by capitalism and the poverty, oppression, and exploitation that comes along with it. As I have demonstrated, the dominant ideology tells us the best way to create this change is through engaging with a nonprofit organization. I've also demonstrated, though, that the structure of the NPIC is extremely corporatized and that the true goals of the people funding this kind of work is to preserve capitalism and protect their wealth. It should come as no surprise then that nonprofit workers are treated just like all other workers, very poorly. Demonstrate what I mean, we need to look no further than right here in Colorado, and the Planned Parenthood of the Rockies, which is the local chapter, I guess you would say, of Planned Parenthood, who we also know is closely associated with the Democratic Party. In 2017, the healthcare workers of Planned Parenthood of the Rocky Mountains unionized with SEIU Local 105. This effort was largely in response to the closure of 6 Planned Parenthoods in the Rocky Mountain region as Donald Trump came to power for the first time. This notably included one in Casper, Wyoming, which was the only Planned Parenthood in the entire state. Of course, low wages was also a part of this unionization effort. According to the union, in 2016, the median annual wage for an employee at Planned Parenthood Rocky Mountains was $35,000. Throughout the union's effort to organize, the CEO, whose salary that year, by the way, was $355,000, so almost 10 times the amount of the workers. She refused to meet with workers and did all the usual anti-union tactics of doing captive audience meetings and posting anti-union flyers, encouraging employees to vote against the union because it would be harmful to their patients. Once the vote to unionize passed, they decided to challenge the effort made by their workers through the National Labor Relations Board and hired a law firm, Fisher Phillips, which specifically advertises union avoidance as one of their specialties. So that's cool. In April 2018, the Trump appointed NLRB sided with Planned Parenthood and said they did not have to recognize the union, although I think they ended up doing so a little bit later. Just within this example, we can see many of the threads discussed tonight at work. Planned Parenthood is a huge nonprofit that provides reproductive and sexual health care, as well as sex education in the United States and around the world. The organization receives money from the federal government through USAID and Medicare, as well as through grants from private foundations, such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundations, as well as the Ford Foundation. However, any funds that comes from the federal government cannot be used to fund abortion, and Bill and Melinda Gates have actually put that stipulation on money from their foundation as well. With reproductive rights constantly under attack by the ruling class in this country, people who want to fight back are drawn to supporting Planned Parenthood in an earnest attempt to do something, as cultural hegemony supports this as an acceptable way to engage with the issue. Because nonprofit workers typically believe deeply in the mission of their organization, they're inclined to accept lower wages and poor working conditions. However, Planned Parenthood as a nonprofit corporation has no problem at all appealing to Republican-led governments when it comes to something that might impact their bottom line, like the unionization of their workers. And those Republican-led governments who campaign on defunding abortion clinics, such as Planned Parenthood, are all too eager to support them in those fights against their workers in the interest of capital. This perfectly illustrates the futility of looking to the NPIC as a way out of capitalism. If the issues that we face are rooted in capitalism, oppression, and imperialism, how can we expect nonprofits who are also complicit in the same system to solve them? It's us. The funneling of people who want to make changes to society into nonprofit organizations takes the place of mass movement that could fight for socialism and eradicate the root cause of these issues. The way that nonprofits are set up with corporate structures, professional activists, and being beholden to billionaires or the government does not allow for people who are receiving these services to have any agency in their own liberation. They become clients, not comrades. The activity of nonprofit organizations is severely limited by what is deemed acceptable to their financial backers, and the landscape amongst these organizations is highly competitive, discouraging collaboration and building of actual power or any kind of solidarity. The people that give out the funding will not grant money to any project that directly challenges the inequality that allowed them to amass that money in the first place. And therefore, no matter how earnest or well-meaning a single NGO or nonprofit worker may be, there are limits built into the system that do not allow them to actually challenge capitalism and eradicate the need for their organization. Of course, what is needed is a mass movement from below of class-conscious workers. To quote Hal Draper from Two Souls of Socialism, the heart of socialism below is its view that socialism can be realized only through the self-emancipation of activized masses in motion, reaching out for freedom with their own hands, mobilized from below in a struggle to take charge of their own destiny as actors, not merely subjects on the stage of history. So in other words, the nonprofit industrial complex can't save us, only we can. The end.